planet didn't have a name. Officially, it was just TC-72, another rock floating in the void, another target for terraforming. We'd been dropped off along with enough supplies to last 6 months. The ship that brought us wouldn't return until then, and when it did, it would come with more people, more equipment. Until that day, we were on our own. No contact, no backup. The company didn't like wasting time or resources on missions like these. You get dropped off, you work, and you survive. I was in charge of the geological survey. "Garrett, see what we're dealing with," the captain had ordered. He didn't have to tell me twice. The rest of the crew followed, dragging equipment out behind them. In every direction, the planet spread, an infinite field of rock and dust. Not the fine, powdery kind. No, this was gritty, abrasive stuff that clogged up filters and jammed equipment if you weren't careful. I flicked a switch on my wrist console, initiating the geological scanner. It whirred softly as it gathered data, pinging in a rhythmic pattern. "Nothing out of the ordinary so far," I muttered, mostly to myself. "Fantastic!" the engineer called out from somewhere behind me, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because things going ordinary is exactly what we signed up for, right?" He was right. Things never stayed ordinary on these missions, but that was just part of the job. "Just get the habitat modules ready," I shot back. "I want them operational before sundown." The sun here moved quicker than we liked. Gave us maybe 7 hours of daylight, tops. We spread out, each member falling into their role. The biologists sifted through samples of dirt and dust, muttering about mineral content and microbial life. The medic set up her equipment near the ship, preparing for whatever nasty surprises the planet's atmosphere had in store. The captain supervised, all stoic and focused, keeping his eyes everywhere at once. We worked in silence, the kind of silence that comes from people who have done this too many times. The first real sign of trouble came from the engineer. "Hey, Garrett," he called, waving me over. He was standing by a rocky outcrop, tapping his wrist console impatiently. "You're the rock guy. Get a load of this." I trudged over, kicking aside bits of stone and dirt. "What is it?" I asked, already annoyed at whatever small distraction he'd found. We had a tight schedule, and anything that threatened to push us behind was a problem. "Got some weird readings underground," he said, holding his wrist up to show me the screen. The data was a jumble of numbers and charts. "See that? Electromagnetic anomalies. Thought it was interference from mineral deposits, but it's too symmetrical." Symmetrical. That word got my attention. Nature wasn't big on symmetry underground, not at these depths. I took a closer look at the readout, frowning. "Could be a lot of things," I said. "Caverns, metal veins, or it's artificial," he interrupted, grinning. "Looks like we've got ourselves a bunker." I hated that grin. He was getting excited, and that meant this was going to complicate things. "Let's check it out," I muttered, more out of obligation than curiosity. If there was a bunker, it meant delays, potential hazards, and questions from corporate. We didn't get paid to find bunkers. We got paid to terraform. The rest of the crew joined us as we made our way to the site. The outcrop was taller than I expected. At its base, buried under layers of dust and rubble, was a metal surface. The engineer cleared away the rubble with a small hand tool, revealing what looked like an entrance. My gut tightened. This wasn't part of the mission. "Looks ancient," the biologist said, squinting at the markings around the entrance. "Definitely not human." I leaned in, inspecting the surface. It was cold and smooth, with patterns etched into it that looked almost geometric. I reached out, running my hand over the grooves. "Feels like some kind of alloy, but I've never seen this design before." "Well, we're not getting anywhere standing around," the captain said. "Get it open." The engineer grinned again, pulling out a plasma cutter from his pack. "You got it, boss," he said, already kneeling down to work. The cutter sparked to life, hissing as it began to carve through the metal. I stepped back, watching the glow of the blade. It didn't take long. The door gave way, a section of it folding inward to reveal a dark, narrow tunnel. The air that rushed out was stale, musty, but not entirely unpleasant. It had that old enclosed space smell you get in long-abandoned places. "After you," the engineer said, gesturing theatrically. I ignored him, flicking on my helmet light and stepping forward. The rest followed, their lights illuminating the path as we descended. The walls were coated in some kind of material that absorbed the light, giving everything a dull, matte finish. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we weren't supposed to find. "Looks like a damn maze," the logistics specialist muttered behind me. "Anyone else getting a bad vibe?" "Cut the chatter," the captain barked. "Focus on the task." His voice echoed slightly, carrying down the tunnel. It was enough to shut us up for the time being. We reached the end of the tunnel, a wide chamber opening up before us. The place was full of bulky, featureless boxes, their panels faintly glowing. I approached, my eyes locking onto the central console in the room. The console activated, light rippling across its surface. "Well, now we're in it," I muttered, glancing back at the others. Might as well see what it has to say. The engineer joined me, working on the console's interface. "Holographic projection," he said. "Looks like it's reconfiguring, translating maybe." "Translating into what?" I snapped. A beam of light shot out from the console, forming a three-dimensional projection. The shapes changed, forming symbols, patterns, then words. Familiar words. "Beginning translation," a voice announced. The projection stabilized, its symbols morphing into recognizable letters. "What is that?" the medic breathed. I couldn't respond. I was staring at the words that had appeared in front of me, words that described things it shouldn't have known. My name, my role, details about my life. This was impossible. "Greetings, crew of the human mission," the voice continued. "You are not the first to step into this place. You will not be the last. This is your record, your life, and your end." The projection shifted, displaying a series of names. Our names. Beside each name, a description. Logistics specialist, crushed beneath the ground. Engineer, suffocated by equipment failure. It went on, detailing each of us in words so precise it felt like a death sentence being read aloud. And then I saw my own name. Geologist Garrett, self-inflicted containment. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Self-inflicted. Containment? I glanced at the others, their faces ashen and shocked. "No," the captain whispered, stepping back. This is some kind of trick. A scare tactic." "Yeah? A trick?" the logistics specialist's voice cracked. "Then, how the hell does it know my name?" I drew in a breath, attempting to control the panic creeping into my thoughts. "It's just some old alien tech. We'll figure this out." I couldn't take my eyes off it. That list, our names, our deaths, just hovered there, taunting us. It knew things it had no right to know. My mind worked overtime trying to rationalize it. Maybe it tapped into our data files, pulled info from our onboard systems. But that didn't explain how it knew details no one else should have known. I hadn't told anyone about half of the stuff it described. No one. The medic, Harper, was frozen, her mouth half open like she wanted to say something, but couldn't get the words out. The biologist, Rhea, was pacing, her eyes darting from the hologram to the tunnel we'd come from, as if weighing her chances of just bolting out of there. The captain was the first to break the silence. "All right, everyone. Let's not lose our heads here." His voice was steady, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. He wasn't as calm as he wanted us to believe. "It's just a recording, some kind of automated system left behind by whoever built this place. We've seen old tech before. Not like this," Rhea snapped, cutting him off. She pointed at the list, her finger trembling. "That thing just predicted how we're going to die. You want to tell me how a bunch of long-dead aliens knew who we are, or what's going to happen to us?" The captain held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. "We don't know that any of this is real. For all we know, this is some malfunctioning database or a scare tactic." Rhea laughed. "Yeah, scare tactic, sure. Let's scare a crew that wasn't even supposed to be here." The logistics specialist, Jax, who had been unusually quiet since we entered, approached. His eyes were locked on the projection, his usual cocky grin long gone. "My name, that's my exact name, and it said I'm going to be buried alive beneath the ground." He glanced at the captain. "Cap, that's too specific to be a malfunction." None of us had an answer for that. Hell, I didn't even have an answer for myself. My name, my job, my fate, all laid out in unblinking letters. Self-inflicted containment. I kept rolling the phrase around in my mind, trying to figure out what it meant. "How does something like this even exist?" Harper finally said, her eyes still glued to the hologram. "It's like it knows us, personally." "It doesn't know shit," the captain said sharply. He turned to the engineer, Nash, who was still standing at the console, staring at the controls like they might bite him. "Nash, turn it off! Shut this thing down!" Nash blinked, coming out of his trance. He nodded quickly and moved to the console, trying to make sense of the controls. "I'm working on it," he muttered. "Just give me a second." He swore under his breath, his fingers fumbling as he hit another sequence. The hologram disappeared, and the room plunged into a silence. "There," Nash said, stepping back from the console. "It's off." "Good," the captain said, taking a deep breath. "Now, we finished what we came here to do. Rhea, Harper, get back topside. Start prepping the samples. Nash, I want a full report on this equipment. Find out what the hell it was and whether there's anything useful for the mission. Garrett." I didn't hear the rest. I was still staring at the console, at the dim lights beneath its surface. That list, those predictions. It knew how we were going to die. It had laid everything out, every detail, as if it had already happened. And that scared the hell out of me. The crew split off, each of them going back to their assigned tasks, trying to bury the unease beneath routine. That's what we were trained for. You find something unexpected, you deal with it, and you move on. No room for doubt or second-guessing. I followed Nash as he inspected the equipment along the walls. "You really think this is just some old tech glitch?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of one of the consoles, eyes narrowed. "I don't know what to think," he finally said. "This is too advanced, too precise. Even if it somehow pulled data from our systems, there's no way it could predict what it did." "You saw your name too," I said. It wasn't a question. I'd seen the name Nash Engineer suffocated by equipment failure. It had stuck in my mind, partly because Nash had always been good with equipment. If something went wrong with the tech, he was the last person I'd expect to go down because of it. Nash clenched his jaw. "Yeah, I saw it." "What if it's not just a scare tactic?" I asked. "What if it's, I don't know, some kind of warning?" Nash shook his head. "Warnings don't come with predictions, Garrett. They come with solutions. And I didn't see any of those in there, did you?" He had a point. The hologram hadn't given us any way out, no escape plan, just hard facts about our deaths. But that didn't mean it wasn't trying to tell us something. Maybe there was more we hadn't seen yet, more we didn't understand. I was about to argue, but the captain's voice cut in abruptly through the radio. "Garrett, Nash, get back to the surface. We've got a lot of work to do, and I'm not sitting around in this bunker all day." "Copy that, Cap," Nash said, cutting the transmission. He glanced at me, then back at the console. "Whatever this thing is, we'll deal with it later. Let's get topside." I followed him back through the tunnel, my mind going over every detail from the hologram. Self-inflicted containment. The words echoed in my head, but I still didn't know what they meant. Did it mean I'd get trapped, suffocate, go insane? As we emerged from the tunnel and back into the harsh light of the planet's surface, I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. The others were already at work, setting up the habitat modules and running diagnostics on the equipment. Business as usual. But the tension was still there, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Harper kept glancing toward the tunnel. Rhea was muttering to herself, her hands moving faster than usual as she packed up her samples. Jax, though, looked worse than all of us. He stood near the ship, staring at the ground like he expected it to swallow him whole. "Buried alive," he whispered. "It's going to bury me alive." I walked over to him, keeping my voice low. "Jax, you need to get your head in the game. We don't know if any of that's real." He looked up at me, sweat beading on his forehead. "Don't we? What if we just triggered something, Garrett? What if that bunker, what if it's some kind of death trap?" I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't have an answer for anyone. We worked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own fears. That hologram wasn't a recording. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a countdown. And it had already started. We all got back to work, but the mood had shifted. You could feel it in the way people moved, like every step could set something off. I focused on the geological scans, trying to drown out the whispers of doubt crawling up the back of my mind. Self-inflicted containment. The words wouldn't leave me alone. It was like a splinter in my brain, digging deeper every time I tried to ignore it. Containment could mean anything out here. Trapped in a cave, buried alive under a rock slide, suffocated in a habitat failure. My job was about containment. I spent years studying how to keep things stable, prevent collapses, ensure everything stayed where it should. And now, that one word was tearing apart everything I thought I knew. I shook my head and looked back at the data on my wrist console. The scans were normal, if normal meant rock, dust, and more rock. The rest of the crew was scattered around the site. The captain was over by the habitat modules, checking the connections, keeping busy. He was good at that, doing something to keep his mind off the bigger picture. Rhea was unloading more equipment with Harper, both of them quiet, working on autopilot. They didn't even look at each other. Nash was up on the ridge, fiddling with the drone we'd sent to survey the surrounding area. He kept swearing under his breath, trying to get it to sync up with the planetary grid. And then there was Jax. He was supposed to be overseeing the excavation, but he was just standing there, staring at the ground like he expected it to give way any second. "Jax!" I called, walking over to him. "You all right?" He didn't answer at first. He just kept looking at the dirt under his feet, his hands clenched into fists. His helmet light reflected off the dust hanging in the air, giving him a ghostly outline in the fading sunlight. "Jax?" I stepped closer, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Snap out of it." He flinched like I'd shocked him, his eyes darting around like he didn't know where he was. "Yeah," he mumbled. "Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking." "You look like you're thinking about your own funeral. We don't need that right now." Jack swallowed hard, still looking down. "What if it's right, Garrett?" he whispered. "What if that thing, it knew, it said I'd be buried alive? And look at this place." He gestured to the barren, craggy landscape. "This whole planet's just waiting to collapse on us." "Listen," I said, gripping his shoulder tighter. "It's just a message. Old tech. We don't know anything about these aliens, and we sure as hell don't know how they got that information. But what I do know is we've done this 100 times. You've done this 100 times. Nothing's gonna happen." I didn't believe a word I was saying, but Jax needed to hear it. Hell, maybe I needed to hear it too. There was a faint commotion in the distance. I couldn't make out what was happening at first. Just muffled voices, something urgent in the tone, but no words. "Something's going on over there," Jax muttered. I hadn't even noticed it at first, but now the panic in the distant voices was unmistakable. I stood up straight, eyes narrowing as I looked toward the habitat module. People were moving, rushing towards something. I caught a glimpse of Harper running, her arms pumping as she dashed across the dusty landscape. "Come on," I said, not waiting for Jax's response. My legs were already moving, my heart picking up speed, even though I didn't know why. Jax jogged after me, his breathing shallow. When we got closer, I could see Rhea standing at the entrance of the habitat module, frozen, staring inside. Her hands were clenched at her sides, like she couldn't figure out whether to go in or run the other way. Harper was by the door too. The look on her face told me everything before I even got close enough to see inside. I pushed past them, stepping into the module. The air inside was thick, Not dusty, not musty, just wrong. It had a heaviness to it, like stepping into a room with no air circulation. I saw the problem immediately. Nash was lying on the floor near the filtration unit, his body crumpled like he'd just dropped where he stood. I didn't need to check for a pulse. The sight of him, his face blue, his lips swollen, told me enough. He'd suffocated. I stepped back, bile rising in my throat. "Toxic gas," Harper said from behind me. "Air filtration system malfunctioned. The room filled with something poisonous." Jax stood next to her, his face pale. "He was alone in here?" "Yeah," Rhea muttered. "He was setting up the air system for the habitat." No one spoke for a while. I stared at Nash's body, trying to piece it together. We all knew the risks out here. Equipment failures were part of the job. But this wasn't a malfunction. This was the prediction, playing out exactly like the message had said. Suffocated by equipment failure. I turned to Jax, but he was staring at the ground, like he didn't want to meet my eyes. He didn't have to say anything. I could see it on his face, the creeping realization that this was only the beginning. Without a word, I walked out of the module, my fists clenched. The world outside was the same, dusty, barren, but everything felt different. He was gone just like that. One moment working, the next, suffocated by machine failure, exactly as the message had said. The captain wasn't wasting any time. Orders were given, supplies were redistributed, and Nash's body was sealed in a cryopod. There was no memorial, no moment of silence. Just business as usual. That's how we operated. But it felt wrong this time. Felt like we were moving too fast past something we couldn't afford to ignore. I noticed it in Jax first. The way his hands wouldn't stay still. He was fidgeting, glancing around, eyes darting over every rock, every loose pile of dirt. He didn't say anything, but I could see it in his face. He was waiting for the ground to open up and take him next. It wasn't long before the cracks in our crew began to show. "You're not helping!" Rhea snapped, slamming her sample case down next to the habitat module. She hadn't spoken much since Nash's death, but now it was like everything was boiling over at once. "What do you want me to do?" Jack shot back. "I'm just trying to make sure I don't end up buried like Nash. You're going to drive us all insane with this paranoia. We have work to do and you—" "Enough!" the captain interjected, stepping between them. His tone was sharp, final. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When the captain spoke, we listened. He stared at Jax for a long moment, and I could see the tension drain from Jax's posture, his shoulders slumping as he backed away. "We keep going," the captain said. "We stay on task. There's nothing else." Rhea didn't argue. She picked up her sample case and walked away, leaving Jax standing there, still fidgeting. I thought about stepping in, saying something to calm him down. But I didn't know what to say. What could I tell him that would make this better? We both knew what the message had said, and no amount of comforting words would change the fact that it had been right about Nash. The pattern was starting to form, and none of us could pretend otherwise. I watched as Jax wandered off, muttering under his breath, his eyes scanning the ground. I busied myself with setting up the geological scanner, the numbers, the data. These were things I could control, things I could understand. But no matter how much I tried to immerse myself in the work, my thoughts kept drifting back to the message. "Garrett!" the captain called out. I looked up from the console to see him walking toward me, his expression as unreadable as ever. "We need to start reinforcing the habitat module. Stabilize the supports before nightfall. Can you and Harper handle it?" I nodded. The captain was trying to keep us moving, keep us distracted. "I'll grab her," I said, heading toward the medical bay where Harper was still working on Nash's post-mortem. She'd been quiet since the incident, keeping her distance from the rest of us. I couldn't blame her. The air felt heavier as I approached the module. I could hear Jax in the distance, mumbling to himself as he paced the perimeter. His voice had taken on a low, almost manic tone, repeating the same thing over and over. I'm next. It's gonna be me." I found Harper inside the module, sitting on one of the storage crates, her gloves off, staring down at her hands like they were someone else's. "Harper," I said, trying to sound normal, like I wasn't holding the same fear she probably was. "Captain wants us to reinforce the habitat structure." She didn't respond right away, just kept staring at her hands. Then finally, she nodded. "Sure," she muttered, standing up and pulling her gloves back on. "Let's get it done." We worked in silence, securing the external supports around the habitat module. The wind was picking up, kicking up clouds of dust around us. Harper didn't speak, just focused on tightening bolts and checking stability readings. I could tell she wasn't really there. Her mind was somewhere else, back with Nash, or maybe with her own prediction. A sudden shout broke the silence. We both froze, turning toward the sound. It was Jax, somewhere near the ridge. We dropped our tools and ran. By the time we reached him, the ground had already given way. Jax was nowhere in sight. All that was left was a freshly collapsed patch of earth, loose dirt and rock still sliding into the hole. Rhea was already there, standing at the edge, staring down into the pit. The captain arrived a few moments later, his eyes scanning the scene with that same cold calculation he always had. Jax was gone, just like that. No one spoke. There was no point in yelling for him. He was buried under tons of dirt and rock. We all knew what had happened. We didn't need to dig him out to confirm it. Buried alive. Exactly as the message had predicted. I crouched down at the edge of the collapse, staring into the dark hole that had swallowed him. I tried to make sense of it, tried to tell myself that this was just bad luck. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. The pattern was too clear now. 2 predictions, 2 deaths. Exactly as foretold. I stood up slowly, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I looked over at the captain. His face was hard, impassive, but I could see the cracks forming in his composure. Rhea was still staring at the hole like she couldn't look away. Harper stood behind me, silent. This was it. This was how it was going to happen. One by one, we'd all go, exactly as the message had said. There was no escaping this. We could try to keep working, try to pretend we could finish the mission and get off this planet. But deep down, we all knew the truth. The message wasn't a warning. It was a script, and we were following it, step by step. I could feel mine coming closer. Self-inflicted containment. I thought I'd figured it out. I'd been checking every sealed compartment, every door, every mechanism, trying to make sure I wouldn't lock myself into some airtight death trap. But every time I thought I was being cautious, the feeling came back. That itch in the back of my mind telling me it didn't matter. Telling me the message was already playing out, and I couldn't stop it. Harper had been quiet since Nash, keeping to herself, doing her medical checks like nothing had changed. She wasn't really with us anymore, not in her head. She'd accepted it. Maybe that was her way of dealing with it, detaching herself from the reality of what was happening. Maybe she thought if she didn't think about it, the message wouldn't catch up to her. But it did. We were working on the structural reinforcements for the habitat, tightening bolts, reinforcing the supports, trying to keep our hands busy, pretending like we were still following the mission. Harper was standing on one of the support platforms, inspecting the connection points on the outer frame. It was a routine check, nothing complicated, nothing risky, but something had shifted in the air. The wind had picked up, dust swirling around us, making the light dim and hazy. I didn't see it happen. I just heard the crack, the sound of something giving way. I turned just in time to see Harper stumble, her footing slipping on the platform. There wasn't any time to react. No one was close enough to catch her. She fell, and for a second, I thought maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe she'd just hit the ground hard, a broken leg, a concussion, something we could fix. But then I saw the blood. A lot of it. Harper had fallen onto a piece of the broken framework, jagged metal that had snapped when the support gave out. It had impaled her, straight through the side. I stood there, staring at her body, and felt the numbness set in. We didn't even rush to her. There was no point. It wasn't an accident. It was the message. It was always the message. The captain came over, looked down at Harper, then back at me. His expression didn't change, but there was something behind his eyes. Something breaking. He didn't say anything, just knelt down and closed her eyes, wiping the blood from his gloves on his uniform. We didn't need to say it. Harper had fulfilled her part in the message, just like Nash and Jax before her. The mission was over. We were next. The captain tried to keep things going, but it was half-hearted now. He knew as well as I did that we were just waiting. He still kept up the charade, running through the checklists, monitoring the equipment, but there was no life behind it anymore. I don't know if he was afraid of the message, or if he was trying to outrun it. Either way, it didn't matter. The captain's death was as clean and efficient as he was. He was inspecting the last structural support, the same ones we'd been reinforcing all day, when the ground shifted beneath him. There wasn't any drama to it, no grand accident. One of the support beams buckled, sending a chunk of the module framework crashing down. The beam caught him right across the neck, snapping it instantly. His body crumpled to the ground, silent, lifeless. I stared at him for a long time, watching the dust settle around his body. There was no panic, no rush to try to save him. He was gone, and that was it. The captain, the man who had held us together through mission after mission, was just another name on the list. Another casualty of the message. Rhea didn't talk much after the captain died. She just kept moving, picking up tasks like a machine, doing what needed to be done without looking up. I think she was trying to make it all go faster. Like if she kept herself busy, maybe the message would come quicker, put an end to this waiting. But it wasn't her time yet. I knew it. The message had been clear about me. Self-inflicted containment. I spent the next few hours moving through the camp, trying to figure out how it would happen. Was it the airlocks? The storage compartments? Some malfunction I hadn't thought of yet. I checked every door, every seal, but no matter what I did, the feeling wouldn't go away. The certainty that it was coming for me. I should have known better. I should have known that no matter how careful I was, the message would find a way. In the end, it was my own hands that did it. I was running a final diagnostic on the habitat's oxygen system, trying to isolate a minor leak in one of the sealed chambers. I stepped inside, the door hissing shut behind me, and started the system scan. The console beeped, asking for an override to complete the sequence. Without thinking, I reached for the controls and initiated the containment protocol. The door locked. I froze, staring at the console as the realization hit me. I'd locked myself in. The oxygen levels were dropping, too slowly to notice at first, but I could feel it now. The air was thinning. I slammed my fists against the door, trying to break the seal, but it was no use. I'd done it myself. I'd triggered the system, locked myself in this room, and now this was how it ended. Self-inflicted containment. I backed away from the door, my breathing shallow as the air grew thinner. My vision was starting to dim, my head pounding as I struggled to keep my thoughts together. This was it. This was the end. I had followed the script, just like Nash, just like Jax, just like Harper and the captain. In my last moments, I wondered if there had ever been a choice. Had we sealed our fates the moment we walked into that bunker, or had the message simply shown us what we were always going to do? I couldn't tell anymore. As the air thinned, my body became sluggish, my legs buckling as I slumped against the wall. My last thought, as my vision faded, was whether we'd ever had a chance at all. Maybe the message didn't predict our deaths. Maybe it made them happen.